The rain hammered against the windows of Ashford Manor with relentless determination, matching the intensity of the argument echoing through its marble halls. Lady Charlotte Ashford stood in the grand drawing-room, her emerald eyes blazing with defiance as her father, the Duke of Worcestershire, paced before the fireplace with barely contained fury. The remains of a shattered vase lay scattered across the Persian rug, a testament to the volatile nature of their confrontation. Charlotte's dark hair had escaped its carefully arranged pins, cascading over her shoulders in a way that would have scandalized the ladies who had attended tea just hours earlier. "You have gone too far this time, Charlotte," the Duke said, his voice low and dangerous. "Mrs. Henderson was the 7th governess you have dismissed through your abominable behavior. No respectable household in England will send their staff to this house anymore." Charlotte lifted her chin, her posture rigid despite the trembling in her hands. She had indeed orchestrated Mrs. Henderson's departure by releasing a family of mice in her quarters and replacing her morning tea with vinegar. But the woman had been insufferably condescending, treating Charlotte like a child who needed to be broken rather than educated. At 22 years old, Charlotte refused to be molded into the docile, decorative wife her father envisioned. The Duchess, Charlotte's stepmother, sat perched on the edge of a velvet settee, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. "Your reputation is in tatters, Charlotte. The entire town speaks of nothing but your scandals. Lord Pemberton withdrew his suit after you corrected his Latin at the Thornbury ball, and Viscount Ashworth's family will not even acknowledge our existence after you publicly questioned his views on the working conditions in his factories." Charlotte fought the urge to smile at that particular memory. The Viscount had been pompous and ignorant, and someone needed to challenge his comfortable indifference to the suffering of those who generated his wealth. "Perhaps I do not wish to marry a man who cannot tolerate intelligence in a woman," Charlotte replied, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions within her. "And perhaps I grow weary of pretending to be something I am not simply to satisfy society's expectations." The Duke turned sharply, his face flushed with anger. "You speak of pretense. Your entire existence is maintained by the very society you disdain. The gowns you wear, the food you eat, the roof over your ungrateful head, all provided by the position you seem so determined to destroy." The words struck deeper than Charlotte would admit, carrying the weight of truth she had wrestled with in countless sleepless nights. She was trapped in a gilded cage, simultaneously benefiting from and suffocating within the rigid structures of aristocratic life. Her mother, the late Duchess, who had died when Charlotte was only 7, had been different, encouraging Charlotte's curiosity, her reading, her questions about the world. But with her passing, Charlotte had lost her only ally, and her father had remarried within 18 months to a woman who valued propriety above all else. "I have made arrangements," the Duke announced, moving to his desk and retrieving a document. "Since conventional approaches have failed, I have hired someone different. Eleanor Whitmore comes from a respectable but modest family, fallen on difficult times. She has worked as a companion and lady's maid for 3 years, and her references speak of remarkable patience and discretion." Charlotte felt her stomach tighten with familiar dread. Another jailer, another person assigned to transform her into the compliant daughter her father desired. "When does this paragon of patience arrive to undertake her impossible task?" she asked, unable to keep the sarcasm from her voice. "She arrived this afternoon," the Duchess interjected, her tone clipped. "She is settling into the servants' quarters as we speak. You will meet her at breakfast tomorrow, and you will extend her every courtesy. If you drive this one away, Charlotte, your father and I have agreed that more drastic measures will be necessary." The threat hung in the air, unspoken, but understood. There were institutions for difficult women, places where families could send daughters who refused to conform. Charlotte had heard the whispers about Lady Fitzwilliam's eldest, who had been sent to a countryside estate and never seen in society again. That evening, Charlotte sat alone in her chambers, staring out at the rain-soaked gardens below. The room was luxurious by any standard. Silk wallpaper, mahogany furniture, shelves lined with books she had collected despite disapproval, but it felt increasingly like a prison. She had tried so many times to explain her frustration, her sense that there must be more to existence than choosing the right gloves and mastering the art of meaningless conversation. But her words fell on deaf ears, met with lectures about duty and gratitude and proper feminine behavior. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts, and one of the housemaids entered with a tray of tea and biscuits. "Begging your pardon, my lady, but cook thought you might not have eaten after the scene earlier." The girl's eyes darted nervously, clearly aware of the household gossip about Lady Charlotte's latest transgression. Charlotte felt a pang of guilt. The servants bore the brunt of the tension her rebellions created, walking on eggshells and scrambling to manage the chaos she left in her wake. "Thank you, Mary," Charlotte said gently, noting how the girl's shoulders relaxed at her civil tone. "Tell me, have you met the new lady's maid?" Mary nodded, setting the tray on a side table. "Miss Whitmore, my lady. She seems different from the others. Quiet, but not in a timid way. She helped Mrs. Cooper in the kitchen even though it weren't her place, and she thanked me proper when I showed her to her room. Strange for someone of her position to be so kind." The description piqued Charlotte's curiosity despite herself, though she quickly suppressed it. After Mary departed, Charlotte attempted to read, but concentration proved impossible. Her mind kept returning to the morning's confrontation and the future that seemed to narrow with each passing day. Her younger brother, Edward, away at Cambridge, wrote letters filled with excitement about his studies, his friends, his freedom to explore ideas and forge his own path. Charlotte loved him deeply, but sometimes struggled with the envy that accompanied his correspondence. He was afforded every opportunity simply by virtue of his gender, while she was expected to ornament drawing rooms and produce heirs. The clock chimed midnight before Charlotte finally extinguished her lamp, slipping into restless sleep, plagued by dreams of locked doors and endless corridors. She woke to grey morning light filtering through her curtains and the realization that today would bring her face to face with Eleanor Whitmore. As she lay in bed, Charlotte made a decision. She would not make this easy. If they insisted on sending keeper after keeper, she would continue to demonstrate that she could not be tamed, could not be transformed into the perfect aristocratic daughter they desired. Perhaps eventually they would simply give up and leave her alone. At precisely 8 o'clock, another knock sounded at her door. "Enter!" Charlotte called, expecting Mary with her morning chocolate. But the woman who stepped into her room was someone entirely new. Eleanor Whitmore was perhaps 5 years older than Charlotte, with auburn hair arranged in a simple but elegant style, and grey eyes that met Charlotte's gaze directly without the usual deference or trepidation. She wore a plain but well-maintained dress in charcoal grey, and she moved with a quiet confidence that immediately distinguished her from the nervous governesses and flustered companions who had preceded her. "Good morning, Lady Charlotte," Eleanor said, her voice calm and clear. "I am Eleanor Whitmore, your new lady's maid. I understand you are accustomed to managing your own morning routine, but I thought we might begin with a simple introduction." Charlotte studied her carefully, searching for signs of judgment or condescension, but Eleanor's expression remained neutral, almost curious. "I did not request a lady's maid," Charlotte replied coolly. "My father seems to believe I require constant supervision, though I am 2 years past my majority." Eleanor nodded thoughtfully, as though Charlotte had said something perfectly reasonable rather than something bordering on insolent. I imagine that must be frustrating. I know something of having one's choices limited by circumstances beyond one's control. The unexpected empathy caught Charlotte off guard, creating a hairline crack in her defensive armor. Most servants would have responded with platitudes or reminded her of her privileged position. Eleanor did neither, instead acknowledging Charlotte's feelings as valid without judgment or lecture. "The Duke and Duchess expect you at breakfast in 30 minutes, Eleanor continued. "Would you prefer assistance dressing, or would you rather I wait outside while you prepare yourself?" The offer of choice, however small, felt significant. Charlotte hesitated, torn between her instinct to reject any cooperation and a growing curiosity about this woman who seemed genuinely uninterested in confrontation. "You may stay," Charlotte said finally. "Though I warn you, I am not pleasant company, and I have a well-earned reputation for driving away anyone assigned to reform me." Eleanor moved to the wardrobe, examining the array of gowns with professional efficiency. "I am not here to reform you, Lady Charlotte. I am here to assist you with whatever you require. If you wish to shock society, drive away suitors, or continue reading philosophy books at breakfast, which I noticed on your side table, that is entirely your affair." She selected a deep blue morning dress, holding it up for Charlotte's approval. This would suit the weather and the occasion, but ultimately the choice is yours. Charlotte rose from the bed, studying Eleanor with new interest. No one had ever acknowledged her reading material without criticism, and no one had ever suggested that her choices might be her own. "You do not think I should be reformed, that I should learn proper feminine behavior and marry an appropriate gentleman?" Eleanor helped Charlotte into the dress, her hands deft and impersonal. "I think that people rarely change because others demand it. They change when they find reasons within themselves, and I think the world would be far less interesting if everyone behaved identically." As Eleanor arranged Charlotte's hair, a simple style that suited Charlotte's features without the excessive ornamentation her stepmother preferred, Charlotte found herself relaxing slightly despite her intentions. This woman was indeed different, and Charlotte could not yet determine whether that made her more dangerous or less. "Why did you take this position?" Charlotte asked suddenly. "You must have heard about me. The entire household staff must have warned you that I am impossible." Eleanor's hands paused briefly before continuing their work. "I took this position because I needed employment, and because impossible is often another word for misunderstood. My previous employer, Lady Margrave, was considered impossible until her family realized she was not hysterical, but suffering from a genuine illness the doctors had dismissed. Sometimes the problem is not the person, but the expectations placed upon them." The answer was honest and thoughtful, delivered without drama or presumption. Charlotte met Eleanor's eyes in the mirror, seeing something there she had not encountered before: genuine interest without agenda, acceptance without judgment. "We shall see how long your patience lasts, Miss Whitmore," Charlotte said, though her voice lacked its usual sharp edge. "I give you 2 weeks before you join the parade of those who have fled Ashford Manor." Eleanor smiled slightly, a subtle expression that transformed her serious features. "Then I suppose we shall both discover whether I am as patient as my references claim. Shall we proceed to breakfast, my lady? I believe the Duke becomes rather irritable when meals are delayed." Charlotte found herself almost smiling in return before catching herself and reassembling her defensive walls. They descended the grand staircase together, Charlotte acutely aware of Eleanor's presence slightly behind and to her left, the proper position for a lady's maid. Yet somehow Eleanor managed to make it feel less like subservience and more like quiet companionship. As they reached the breakfast room doors, Charlotte steeled herself for another tense meal filled with criticism and demands. But for the first time in months, she felt a small, dangerous flutter of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, Eleanor Whitmore might indeed be different from all the rest. The breakfast room at Ashford Manor was a monument to restrained elegance, with morning light filtering through tall windows overlooking the east gardens. The Duke sat at the head of the mahogany table, his newspaper creating a barrier between himself and the family, while the Duchess occupied herself with correspondence, her pen scratching across expensive stationery with meticulous precision. Charlotte entered with Eleanor, trailing appropriately behind, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as her father lowered his paper to regard her with critical assessment. His eyes swept from Charlotte's simply arranged hair to her modest dress, and she saw the slight surprise register before his expression hardened into its customary disapproval. "You are punctual this morning," the Duke observed, his tone suggesting this was more suspicious than commendable. "I trust Miss Whitmore's arrival has not disrupted your usual routine." Charlotte took her seat, accepting tea from the footman with a polite nod. "Miss Whitmore has been perfectly adequate. I see no reason why this arrangement should differ from previous ones." The lie came easily, a protective measure against the hope she had felt earlier. If her father sensed that Eleanor might actually reach her, he would wield that connection as leverage, and Charlotte refused to give him that power. Eleanor had withdrawn to the servants' corridor, adjacent to the breakfast room, the proper place for ladies' maids during family meals, but Charlotte found herself oddly conscious of her absence. The Duchess set down her pen with deliberate precision, her pale blue eyes fixing on Charlotte with the calculating gaze she had perfected over years of managing social hierarchies. "Lady Pemberton has invited us to her summer garden party next week. I have accepted on your behalf. This will be an opportunity to repair some of the damage your recent behavior has caused." Charlotte's jaw tightened, but she forced herself to remain calm, cutting into her breakfast with measured movements. "I was not aware that my social calendar required repairing," Charlotte replied evenly. "Perhaps Lady Pemberton should spend less time concerning herself with my reputation and more time addressing her son's gambling debts, which are the subject of considerably more interesting gossip." The Duke's fist came down on the table hard enough to rattle the china, his face flushing with the anger Charlotte had learned to provoke with surgical precision. "Enough. You will attend the garden party. You will behave with impeccable manners, and you will demonstrate that you are capable of functioning in civilized society. Miss Whitmore will accompany you, and I expect her to report on your conduct." The betrayal struck immediately, confirming Charlotte's worst suspicions. Eleanor was not merely a lady's maid, but a spy, another tool in her father's arsenal to control and contain her. Charlotte set down her utensils carefully, fighting the urge to storm from the room and prove every terrible thing they believed about her. How efficient. A companion and an informant in one convenient package. I trust Miss Whitmore's salary reflects her additional duties. The sarcasm dripped from every word, and Charlotte caught the Duchess's satisfied smile at having provoked the reaction she had been anticipating. The remainder of breakfast passed in hostile silence, with Charlotte methodically consuming her meal while internally seething at her own foolishness. She had allowed herself to consider that Eleanor might be different, that perhaps someone might actually see beyond the difficult daughter narrative to the woman trapped underneath. But of course, it had been illusion. Everyone in this house ultimately served her father's interests, and Eleanor Whitmore was no exception. When Charlotte finally rose from the table, she swept from the room without waiting for Eleanor, taking a perverse pleasure in forcing her keeper to scramble to follow. Charlotte headed directly for the library, her sanctuary within the oppressive manor. The room stretched 2 stories high, lined with thousands of volumes collected by generations of Ashfords, though Charlotte suspected she was the only family member who actually read them with any regularity. She pulled down a volume of John Stuart Mill's essays, deliberately choosing something her father would find inappropriate for female readership, and settled into the window seat that overlooked the gardens. Eleanor entered moments later, closing the door quietly behind her and standing near the entrance, apparently content to wait in silence. "You may report to my father that I am reading inflammatory philosophy and corrupting my feminine mind," Charlotte said without looking up from her book. "I am certain he will find it appropriately concerning." Eleanor moved closer, though she maintained a respectful distance. "Your father instructed me to report on your conduct at social events, not to spy on your private activities." "There is a distinction," Charlotte laughed bitterly, finally meeting Eleanor's steady gaze. "How convenient that you define your treachery so narrowly. Do you tell yourself that makes you more honorable than the others?" To Charlotte's surprise, Eleanor's expression flickered with something that might have been hurt before resuming its customary calm. "I understand your anger, and I do not expect you to trust me, but I would ask you to consider that I also have limited choices in this situation. I need this position, Lady Charlotte. My family depends on the income I send home. I will fulfill the duties I was hired to perform, but I will not manufacture problems where none exist, nor will I betray confidences you share with me in private." The honesty in her voice gave Charlotte pause, introducing uncomfortable complexity into her desire to simply hate everyone involved in this arrangement. "Why should I believe you?" Charlotte asked, her voice softer now, tinged with the exhaustion of constant battle. "Every person my father employs ultimately serves his interests. You cannot promise independence you do not possess." Eleanor considered this carefully before responding. "You are correct. I cannot promise complete independence. But I can promise that I will not lie to you, and that I will execute my duties as narrowly as possible. If your conduct at social events is appropriate, I will report that. If it is scandalous, I will report that as well. But what you read, what you think, what you feel, those are yours unless you choose to share them." Charlotte studied Eleanor's face, searching for deception and finding only forthright acknowledgement of difficult circumstances. It was not the answer she wanted, some dramatic declaration of loyalty or rebellion against the Duke's authority, but it was honest, and perhaps honesty was more valuable than empty promises. "Very well. Miss Whitmore, I accept your terms, such as they are, but do not expect friendship from this arrangement. You are an employee performing a function, nothing more." Even as she said it, Charlotte recognized the defensive cruelty in her words, but she could not seem to stop herself from pushing people away before they could disappoint her. Eleanor nodded, apparently unbothered by Charlotte's harshness. "Understood, my lady. Shall I leave you to your reading, or would you prefer company? I am quite capable of quiet occupation if you find my presence less objectionable than solitude." The offer surprised Charlotte, as did her own reluctance to send Eleanor away. The library suddenly seemed less lonely with another person present, even if that person was technically her keeper. "You may stay," Charlotte conceded. "There is a writing desk by the east window if you require occupation. I assume you have correspondence or other tasks." Eleanor settled at the indicated desk, retrieving materials from the practical bag she carried, and for the next hour both women worked in companionable silence. Charlotte tried to focus on Mill's arguments about individual liberty and the tyranny of social conformity, painfully relevant to her circumstances, but she found her attention drifting to Eleanor. The woman worked with focused efficiency, her pen moving across paper with the confidence of someone well-educated despite her current position. Charlotte wondered about Eleanor's family circumstances, the misfortune that had reduced them to dependence on employment income, but she refused to ask. Curiosity would imply interest, and interest would create vulnerability. At midday, a housemaid arrived to announce that Lady Ashworth had called and was waiting in the drawing room. The Duchess had sent for Charlotte to receive their visitor with appropriate courtesy. Charlotte closed her book with audible frustration, every fibre of her being resisting the performance she would be expected to deliver. "Lady Ashworth is the Viscount's mother," Charlotte explained to Eleanor as they prepared to descend. "She despises me for embarrassing her son, and this visit is undoubtedly designed to make me as uncomfortable as possible while maintaining superficial politeness. Welcome to the sophisticated world of aristocratic society." Eleanor walked beside Charlotte through the corridors, and just before they reached the drawing room, she spoke quietly. "For what it is worth, Lady Charlotte, you were correct to challenge the Viscount at the Thornbury ball. Factory conditions are unconscionable, and someone should question those who profit from human suffering. That you had the courage to do so publicly speaks well of your character, regardless of social consequences." The unexpected validation struck Charlotte with surprising force, and she felt her defensive armor crack slightly. Before she could formulate a response, they entered the drawing room, where Lady Ashworth and the Duchess awaited. The visit proceeded exactly as Charlotte had anticipated. A carefully orchestrated exercise in veiled hostility disguised as social courtesy. Lady Ashworth commented on Charlotte's appearance with observations designed to wound. Her complexion looked tired. Perhaps she was not sleeping well. Such a shame that Charlotte's musical accomplishments had never matched her dear brother Edward's. Had Charlotte heard that Lord Pemberton was now courting the lovely Miss Thornbury, who possessed both beauty and appropriate feminine modesty? Charlotte endured it all with gritted teeth and minimal responses, acutely aware of Eleanor standing discreetly near the wall, presumably cataloguing every moment for her eventual report. When Lady Ashworth finally departed, leaving behind a trail of expensive perfume and satisfied malice, Charlotte remained frozen in her chair, trembling with suppressed rage and humiliation. The Duchess rose smoothly, gathering her skirts with practiced grace. "That was barely adequate, Charlotte. Your responses bordered on rude, and your expression left no doubt about your feelings. You must learn better control if you expect to function in society." With that assessment delivered, she swept from the room, leaving Charlotte alone with Eleanor and the wreckage of her composure. Charlotte stood abruptly, moving to the window and pressing her forehead against the cool glass. She would not cry. She had learned years ago that tears only provided her tormentors with additional satisfaction. But the effort of containing her emotions required every bit of strength she possessed, and she felt herself shaking with the strain. She heard Eleanor approach quietly, maintaining respectful distance while making her presence known. "Lady Ashworth is a profoundly unpleasant woman," Eleanor observed matter-of-factly. "Her son is a pompous fool, and her comments were designed specifically to cause pain. You showed remarkable restraint in not throwing something at her." The unexpected sympathy broke through Charlotte's defenses, and she released a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "You are supposed to report my inadequate behavior, not compliment my restraint." Eleanor moved to stand beside her at the window, both women gazing out at the gardens where rain had begun falling again. "I will report that you received Lady Ashworth with appropriate courtesy despite provocation. That is accurate. Your feelings about the encounter are irrelevant to conduct assessment." Charlotte turned to study Eleanor's profile, seeing genuine compassion in her expression. "Why are you being kind to me?" Charlotte asked, her voice raw with confusion and exhaustion. "You gain nothing from it, and it would be easier to simply join everyone else in condemning me." Eleanor met her gaze steadily, and Charlotte saw depths of understanding in those grey eyes that suggested Eleanor carried her own burdens and battles. "Because you deserve kindness, Lady Charlotte. because being difficult is not the same as being wrong. And because I suspect that beneath your rebellion lies someone desperately trying to be seen and heard, rather than simply managed and contained. The observation was so accurate, so devastatingly precise, that Charlotte felt her carefully maintained walls begin to crumble. No one had articulated the core of her struggle with such clarity, and hearing her truth reflected back from another person created a connection Charlotte had not experienced since her mother's death. "I do not know how to exist in this world," Charlotte admitted quietly, the confession escaping before she could stop it. "I cannot be the daughter they demand, but I am trapped by circumstances that make rebellion ultimately futile. What is the purpose of fighting when defeat is inevitable?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment, considering her response with the same thoughtfulness she brought to every interaction. Perhaps the purpose is not victory, but authenticity. Perhaps choosing to be yourself, even in the face of opposition, matters more than success measured by others' standards. Your mother must have been someone quite special to have raised a daughter with such fierce commitment to truth and justice. I imagine she would be proud of your courage, even if she might counsel slightly more strategic application. The mention of her mother caught Charlotte completely off guard, and this time she could not prevent the tears that began to fall.